Alright guys, welcome to the Utah Airguns Workshop channel where we're going to show you how to reseal an amp regulator on an impact. The amp regulator is universal throughout most of the FX airguns, so the removal and reseal and reinstallation should all be relatively similar. I guess just getting to the regulator on the different guns is what's going to be different. So we're just going to show you the impact today. It seems to be the most complex, and so we'll just take it from the top and show you how to get to the regulator, remove it, reseal it, and then reinstall it properly. Okay, so the tools you're going to need are a set of forceps, a 5mm ball head Allen wrench, a 2.5mm Allen wrench, a number 2mm Allen wrench, some brass picks for digging out O-rings and stuff and not scratching the block of your rifle. If you scratch the internals, that's going to create a leak that you cannot fix, and that's why we use brass, because it is softer than the metal used to make the gun. And I will also have my everyday carry Bondus ball head Allen keys. Just in case we have a hard to reach screw or a screw that's giving us some troubles, we'll just use the ball heads there. You also need some silicone grease. We use Trident here at Utah Airguns, and a amp reg reseal kit. I also use some masking tape to put on the gauges once I've done the repair, so I can monitor that the needle on the gauge doesn't travel too far, or even if it does travel 5 or 10 bar, it's easy to keep track of that, whereas if you didn't, it's hard to remember exactly where you left the gun at. So that's why we use the masking tape. So first off, we're going to take off the bottom rail of this impact with the 2.5mm Allen key. Alright, we will set the rail to the side. Next thing you'll have to do is remove the shield that covers your trigger group. We need to remove the trigger to allow access to the actual regulator. So at that point, we'll use the 2mm Allen key and just loosen these screws here, take them out. Okay, we'll just set the shield to the side. After you've removed the shield that covers the trigger group, you will want to take out the second pin from the front of the gun. That is what's holding your trigger in currently. It is spring loaded, so you want to hold right here on the trigger so it doesn't fly away. Obviously make sure the gun is decocked and unsafe before you start this process, because right now when you pull this pin out, it will release the hammer, and if it's cocked, you're going to be scared. So we'll just take out this pin. Okay. Now you can see the trigger group is free, as well as the pin. And that will allow you access into your regulator. So before we get to the regulator, we need to degas the gun. And so we will remove the bottle. Okay, remove the bottle. Once you have removed the bottle off the gun, you want to take your 2.5mm Allen. This one needs to be a ball head. And you're going to go counterclockwise with the regulator adjuster screw. That is the little screw in the center of that brass plug you see underneath the trigger. And just crack that. And now our regulator pressure and plenum pressure, everything, I guess after the regulator is degassing at this time. So we will just wait till we see the gauge in the rear that monitors your regulator, your second regulator. Make sure it's just at 0 before you continue with the teardown. Now all the air is gone. We can take the adjuster screw the rest of the way out. And sometimes it doesn't want to come all the way out because of the O-rings that are on it. So I will just get the forceps, just grab the inside and just wiggle it to get it out. That's what your reg adjuster screw should look like. Has the 2 O-rings on here. If you notice that your regulator is leaking out of the face of this adjuster screw, it is most likely because of these 2 O-rings. And so where that will manifest is at the front of the reg, and you can put soapy water there, and if it bubbles out of the front of the reg, this could be one of the culprits. Moving on, we want to take the regulator housing out, and that is the big brass port that you see there. And you will use your 5mm ball head, must be a ball head, and go counterclockwise. Most of the time, if your reg is leaking out of the face, it's going to be either this O-ring or the 2 O-rings on the adjuster screw, okay? So on removing this regulator assembly, we got lucky because the piston stayed inside of the regulator housing, and that just makes the retrieval way easier because everything came out in one sweep. Sometimes the regulator housing will detach or just, come off of the piston because the piston is stuck pretty well in the bottom of the block of the rifle. And then you would just use your forceps, grab this part here, and pull the rest of the piston out of the regulator hole in the gun. So some people might be wondering what these little washers are. Those are your Belleville washers. The way they are stacked will basically control your range of regulator pressures that you can set the gun to. So if you stack these in different configurations, you'll be able to achieve maybe wider or smaller ranges of pressures for your rifle. We're just going to keep everything the same for this video, and that would be 11 Bellevilles, and they alternate, which I'll show you later. But let's continue with the removal of everything out of the regulator. Once you have taken out the piston, there is an O-ring at the bottom of the regulator slot or hole, we'll call it, and that is in the actual block of the rifle. This is where the brass picks come into play. So I use a pick that is curved on the end to hook out like a candy cane almost, and then I put another kick on the brass pick just to get a little more maneuverability inside of that reg hole. There's not a whole lot of space. It's maybe a 1/2 inch in diameter, and there's an O-ring at the bottom of the threads which your reg house screws into, and that's what seals around your reg house. And if you are experiencing leaks from this hole right here, that could be a culprit. The O-ring inside the trigger block, inside the threads of the reg house, if that O-ring has gone bad, it will manifest right here in this weep hole. Another cause for you to be getting a leak out of this hole would be the O-ring at the bottom of your reg piston. Another reason could be your piston failed altogether, causing a leak out of that weep hole. And the last thing that could cause it is the O-ring that is in the base of the reg house. So right at the end of my pick on the inner lip, I'm going along it right now, that O-ring, if it's gone bad, it will also manifest here at this weep hole. So there's 4 things that could be a cause of a leak here, and if you check those 4 things, chances are you're going to find something that had gone wrong causing it to leak out of here. So enough said there. Let's see if we can dig out the O-ring out of the trigger block, and in my opinion that is the hardest O-ring in the block to remove. So if you can remove that one, you're good to go for the rest of the gun. Alright, so now I've got my pick down into the O-ring that seals around the regulator housing. It is at the bottom of the threads there, so if you're having trouble locating it or wondering what we're talking about. So I have got my pick on the top side of the O-ring, and I'm just going to roll my pick to see if I can get underneath that O-ring. I was able to dislodge it, so now I'm going to hook around it, and we just retrieved the O-ring there. So let's just set that aside. Now you are ready to start resealing your regulator. So we're going to put the gun aside, and I'm going to show you all the parts and O-rings of the regulator and how you can reseal it. So the first thing I like to do is reseal the reg house itself. That is this big brass piece. There's an O-ring on the outside, and there is one on the inside. The O-ring that we're going to remove first is the C41, which is a 7.5 by 2 NBR 70 O-ring. So let's get the pick underneath that, come over the top and just start to pry that over. Easy removal there. The next one we're going to remove is the O-ring inside this under or the bottom lip of the reg house, and that is a 4 by 1.5 NBR 70 O-ring. And kind of that same idea, you want to get the pick underneath the O-ring and then roll the pick until it pulls that O-ring out. Okay. So now that we've removed these O-rings, we'll move on to the next piece, which will be your regulator piston. What I'll usually do, honestly, is just take off your Belvilles in their pairs. So you should have a set of three as you take off the very first. Hang on a second, it's getting all jumbled. Okay, so we've got our first three. We've got our next two. The next two. The next two. And the last two. And I just like to keep them in order just so I don't have to worry about restacking them and remeasuring all of them, because these actually have different thicknesses, and that helps determine the range of pressure you can achieve once you put the gun back together. So I will show you the first stack that we took out of the sequence, and there's 3 of them. And so the first one, it's like a bowl shape basically. So the opening of the bowl will face down. The next one will also, the bowl will face down. And the third Belville, the bowl will face up. And then it alternates after that. So after those 3, it would be bowl down and then bowl up, and so on and so forth for the rest of them. You should have 11 total Belvilles. So we've got those off of the piston rod, and we have another 4 by 1.5 O-ring to remove. Don't stab yourself in the finger like I almost did. Actually, a nice tip is to pinch the O-ring so you get a little bit of it hanging off, and that should be easier to slip your pick into, and then you can just roll that O-ring off. Okay. So now we have taken the O-ring off the piston. If you have a plastic one or Delrin one, just give that a further inspection. Make sure you don't see any cracking or anything sheared off or rounded off. You know, that could be a cause for a leak or a malfunction. So just make sure you inspect that. Everything should look fine. Okay, so after that, we have the reg adjuster screw. And again, we will just remove these little O-rings here. They are an absolute pain, and you're probably going to stab your finger, but that's the fun of air rifles, right? Again, you can do the pinch technique. Pinch the O-ring out to give yourself a lip to slip the pick under, and then roll that O-ring off. Oop, I broke the O-ring, but that's just fine because we're going to replace it anyways. So now we have completely stripped out all the O-rings out of our regulator assembly. So by the end, you should have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 O-rings that don't have a home. You should have 11 Belville washers, a reg adjuster screw, the reg piston, and the reg housing. So just for your guys' sake, I'm going to replace the O-ring inside of the regulator housing that we already have out, just so you guys have an idea of how to get that back in there. That one is a little bit tricky. These other ones are pretty easy and self-explanatory. You just kind of guide the O-ring back on. But for this one, it is a little bit more tricky, so I'm going to show you actually how to do that one. A lot of you won't have to worry about this because you will have the full-on rebuild kit, and that has the O-rings already installed, so there isn't any problem with trying to get this stuff back into where it goes. Before we slip that O-ring in, let's get a little bit of Trident grease, which it's good because it preserves the O-ring, but it's bad because now it's all slippery. You're not going to get a good grip on the O-ring, and you might say some bad words. But you know, that's all part of it. It's all part of the fun. So I like to pinch the end of the O-ring and give myself a little curve because you're trying to fit it into the inner lip of the reg housing. So you just pinch it and then kind of guide that O-ring. Oh, see, it just jumped out. Okay, we'll go for try number 2. I may have lied when I said the trigger block O-ring was the hardest one, because this one is kind of a pain as well, but whatever. Alright, I think I've got it into the lip on the side that's faced towards me. And so you'll just want, once you've got at least part of it into that channel underneath the lip of this bottom side, it's easy for it to work itself into where it needs to go. It'll just want to naturally fit into that slot. You just kind of have to massage it into place. So take number 2, we got that O-ring to seat inside that bottom lip. And that O-ring actually seals around your regulator piston. So that creates a nice seal there. We don't want any leakage between the piston and the reg house. Okay, so once we have kind of resealed all that, get all the O-rings back on your parts if you are going to do it this way. If not, you will pull out your kit. Comes with a O-ring measuring tape. That's pretty cool. FX will provide that. A new regulator housing. A new 10 by 1.5 O-ring, and that's the one that we pulled out very first. That was inside the trigger block, and it seals around the regulator housing. We have a new Belleville washer stack. If you missed one, or you feel like any of yours are damaged or aren't working quite right, you can refresh them with a new set of Bellevilles. You have a new brass reg piston, and you'll have the new reg adjuster screw with the O-rings already on there, so you don't have to try and get those tiny little baby O-rings back onto the adjuster screw. Now, without further ado, we will put the O-ring back into the trigger block and begin the reinstallation process of the regulator. So next, it's actually a kind of a trick tip to getting the trigger block O-ring back in, that 10 by 1.5. That is the biggest pain on the gun to repair. We're gonna make that a little easier. I don't know if the majority of everyone else outside the shop does this, but this is definitely a UA shop trick tip. So I will actually put on the Bellevilles back onto the reg piston the same way we unstacked them. Okay. And then I will grab the end just ever so gently. You don't want to scar anything. Grab the end of the piston, get the dog hair out of there. Cool. After I've greased up the O-ring on the bottom of the reg piston, I'm going to slide it back down the reg hole. Okay. Looks like that went all the way down in. I will get the back end of a pick and just push on that reg piston just to make sure it's actually seated. All right, so we've put the reg piston in now. So we have a shelf for our trigger block O-ring, that 10 by 1.5 that I keep mentioning is such a pain to install. Again, before you reinstall any O-rings, make sure you properly grease them up, just with a thin layer of the Trident or silicone grease. So first start with it on the edge there. I'm doing it one-handed, so I might do it a little funny. We'll guide that O-ring down into where it needs to be. And I'll kind of use my pick to help guide the O-ring into that slot it needs to be in. So there, with that push, I got it to seat most of the way of where it needs to go. So there is just a little bit more massaging I have to do to get that O-ring to seat. So the purpose of putting the piston in first with the Belleville's is to give that O-ring a shelf to bottom out against. So if you don't have that in there, it's gonna be really hard to get that O-ring to slide into its slot where it needs to go without you having something to bottom it out on. So always remember, put the piston with the Belleville's in before you try and install that trigger block O-ring. And sometimes it's easier to actually do it with an Allen key. It's not as thick. So we've almost got it all the way secured. I'm just going to use the back of my ball end to see how it just flipped up into its spot. So now we have successfully reinstalled the trigger block O-ring. Now we are good to put the reg house back into that channel. All right, so now that we have the reg piston and the trigger block O-ring installed, as well as the Belleville washers, the next step will be to install your reg house. And again, we'll use the 5mm ball head, and we will start that reg house into its slot and go clockwise until you feel it shoulder up. So right there, I felt it. And you'll just give it a little bit of tension, not enough to roll the wrench inside of the hex, but enough to where you can feel it really bottom out. Next, we will do the regulator adjuster screw, and that is with the 2.5mm ball head Allen key. So I'll push it past so the O-rings are for sure past the threads, because if you screw the O-ring through the threads, you may shear it and you're going to end up right where you started with a leaky regulator. And I can't stress this enough, make sure you re-lube the O-rings before they go back in the gun. That will ensure the longevity of your reseal and make the reg last longer as well. So we've got the reg adjuster back in. I usually go more further shut than I think it needs to be, because you can always increase the pressure without degassing the gun, and that is a much more efficient way to adjust your reg rather than going from high pressure to low. You always want to start with a low pressure and work your way up to a higher pressure. So at this point, we're going to reinstall the trigger. So as we put our trigger back in, you want to notice that there's a spring on the trigger as well as the Pac-Man. So looking down into the rifle, there is a slot. As you can see, let me point to it. It's about right there. And that is where you need to insert the spring from the trigger group. And you'll just slide your trigger down into that slot, okay? From there, you can turn the gun over. And there's the Pac-Man, and you can see the housing it needs to go into. And we just want to line the Pac-Man hole up with the hole that is attached to the frame or chassis of the rifle. And using the pin helps align that properly. So I've got it in there. Now we'll just push the pin in a little further. Okay, so now the trigger isn't flying out, which means you've installed it properly. the next step is to reinstall the shield for your trigger group. And this is where you'll use your 2mm Allen key. At this point, I will install the bottle before I install the Saber Tactical bottom rail, just for ease of installing this bottle. I don't want to scratch my fingers or the bottle, so we're doing it without the rail. As far as I can tell, there's nothing crazy, no serious leaks. We are going to monitor the gauges to make sure there isn't a leak we aren't hearing. But from this point, we're good to reinstall the Saber rail. Before I do that though, I'm going to check my reg pressure and make sure it's about where we need it to be. And when I removed the old reg, it was set at 100 bar. And as you can see, this one is currently at 100 bar, so that's where I'm going to leave it. At that point, I know I'm good to reinstall the Saber Tactical rail. Get your 2.5mm Allen key. Just tighten those babies up. Don't go too tight or your service techs here at Utah Airguns aren't going to be strong enough to remove them. So just keep us in mind. We don't need Hulk strength. All right. And that is almost done. The final step, and this is optional, you don't have to do it, but if you want to make sure that you're being the most efficient you can be with your time and your install, you'll want to put a little piece of tape that aligns with, you want to cover the top end of your gauge because you know you're not going to gain pressure if the reg's leaking. It's only going to decrease pressure if there's a leak. So I will put the tape on the up or the higher reg pressure side of the needle just to monitor that. And then most times regulators don't leak down or creep down in pressure, they actually creep up in pressure. So to ensure that we're not getting any creep, I'm going to put this tape again on the higher pressure side of the needle. And if I have the time, I'll let that sit for at least 24 hours and just monitor that those needles aren't moving. If the bottle was just barely filled, you should see around a 10 to 15 bar decrease in pressure once everything is cooled down. That's just the way this high pressure air stuff works. And so if it only goes down 10 to 15 bar, you can redo your tape test. And if it doesn't sink any more from there, then it is, you're safe to say that there isn't a leak in the rifle and you're good to go. All right, guys, that's how you remove, reseal, and reinstall an amp regulator. We have a lot of other tutorials and tricks, tips, and other stuff related to air guns on our Utah Airguns workshop channel. The link will be provided in the description. Give it a follow and make sure you subscribe, comment what you want to see, and like our videos. Thanks.